The entire classroom fell silent, not out of respect but out of sheer incredulity. At the front of the room, an 11-year-old boy clutched the broken pieces of his violin, the only present from a father he hardly remembered. The teacher, still furious, made no attempt to express regret. Caleb Bryant said nothing. He just collected what he could from the chilly tile floor of that prestigious academy and left the room in silence. Nobody knew, not even the teacher or the giggling students, who was going to enter through that door, and when it did, their entire world would tip over. This is a narrative of unnoticed talent, ignored suffering, and quiet retaliation that would be delivered not by threats or rage, but by something far more potent: the truth, played through the hands of a young kid securely gripping the violin case. Caleb ascended the stairs of the tall new building that smelt of expensive wax and fresh paint. Everything felt brand new and polished, save for the familiar weight of fear pressing against his chest. New York City was overwhelming and swiftly growing, but there he was, a small boy with a huge gift that no one could see. He and his mother had recently moved there, and his mother, Lauren Bryant, had recently received a major promotion, something no one had predicted: a black woman from a low inc. No one told Caleb how much it would hurt to start over. Lauren tried to ease the pain by packing his favorite breakfast, choosing his new uniform, and brushing his hair with gentle fingers after years of tenderness. On the inside, though, she was just as anxious as he was, but she covered it up with a smile. "You'll make friends," she said in a light voice on the way to school. "The kind you give just so your mother won't worry." "I know, Mom." When Caleb entered the classroom, the room was silent for a few awkward seconds. He could feel their stares, some curious, some judgmental. The teacher straightened her glasses and said bluntly, "You must be the new student, Caleb, right?" The school was huge, with golden-lettered signs, gilded gates, luxury cars dropping off, polished kids with backpacks, and more expensive than some families rent to Lauren. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and she gestured dismissively towards a desk in the rear, saying, "Sit there." No greetings, no introductions, just a hand wave. The violin had been Caleb's voice since he was a little child. He had learnt it by ear, heart, and soul without the need of fancy lessons or organized classes. Caleb proceeded to the seat against the wall, dropping his gaze and already expecting what was to happen. When music class started, the teacher asked each student to play something. Caleb waited patiently one by one while his classmates fumbled through simple, clumsy pieces. When it was his turn, Caleb carefully took his battered violin out of its case, placed it on his shoulder like he was greeting an old friend, and started to play. There was no sheet music, no help, just him, and the sound was soft, sorrowful, aching, the kind that slows the heartbeat. Even those who didn't want to listen found themselves holding their breath. The teacher said nothing while he played, just observing with an unreadable expression. When he finished waiting for praise, she simply said, "Improvising can be charming, but here we value technique." She turned away and called up the next student, which made Caleb's heart sink even more than a shout. He packed up the violin, went back to his seat, and disappeared into silence. Days went by, each one harder than the last, and when he answered questions, it seemed as though he hadn't spoken at all. However, Caleb persevered because he knew it wasn't him, but rather the world around him, too blind to hear what lived inside his chest. Every night, after feigning for his mother that everything even though Caleb never mentioned it, Lauren could hear the sadness tucked between the notes of the music that floated up through the pipes. The elite school wasn't just about grades. It was also about appearance, connections, and fitting a mold. Caleb's very presence seemed to disturb that his gift couldn't be neatly boxed the way they liked Ms. Whitmore. From day one, the music teacher treated him differently than the other students. She smiled, joked, and encouraged Caleb, but she was clipped critical cold during rehearsals for a school performance. Each student was given a solo, and Caleb practiced diligently in the basement, perfecting every note. When it was his turn, he played with trembling grace, and there was silence until Ms. Whitmore crossed her arms and said, "Caleb, please follow the sheet. This isn't street music." Caleb averted his eyes and sat down as laughter echoed through the classroom. He said nothing, but the taunting intensified, with one person saying, "Play some rap on that violin, Caleb. Be careful, those are expensive." Even if the jokes were little, he endured them all in silence since he had discovered that responding to them simply made them worse. Even during lunch, he sat by himself, pushing food about his plate as children gathered in boisterous groups to share tales of fancy clothes and trips to Europe. At home, he lied to his mother about how school was going, saying things like, "Good, honey, we're working on a new piece." Lauren grinned, glad she didn't know. Because he didn't want her sacrifices to be in vain, and he didn't want to be ungrateful, he hung on even though her kid was breaking inside. However, every night the violin sung his sorrow into the walls of that dilapidated cellar. He timidly offered to perform an arrangement he had composed that combined elements of classical and current music one day in music class. Ms. Whitmore gave him permission to begin, but she interrupted him after a few seconds. Caleb realized that this was a serious music program and not a playground, so he quietly put away his violin. Later that day, he noticed that his name was missing from the list of performers for the upcoming spring recital. Confused, he approached Ms. Whitmore and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, I think there's a mistake. I'd love to perform." She didn't even look up, so she didn't even check. Caleb's violin case was purposefully knocked over in the cafeteria by Benjamin, the loudest boy in the class. The violin barely survived the incident. "Oops, sorry, maestro." More painful than any thrust was the laughing that surrounded them. When Ms. Whitmore noticed that she was averted at home, Lauren inquired about his day. "Fine, Mom." When she returned home early one evening, Caleb wasn't in his room. Instead, she found him in the bathroom, sitting on the floor playing the violin, so softly that it sounded like a heartbeat. She wasn't blind, but she did notice the dark circles under his eyes, the lack of music in the house, and the hollow look he was trying to hide. Lauren leaned against the door and wept with him in quiet, as the tears fell softly down his cheeks. When Stonewald arrived there in person, Miss Whitmore greeted her with a stiff grin after she had contacted the school the following day to demand a meeting. "Despite his skill, your kid lacks self-control." Lauren maintained eye contact. "Perhaps you are simply unable to hear my son's heartbeat." Caleb appeared lighter following that altercation, so he practiced once more. Something ignited inside of him, and then he received the news that he would be returning to the recital program for the first time in months. He was overjoyed, but on the day of the performance, just before he was set to take the stage, Miss Whitmore told him that his solo had been canceled once more, giving priority to students with formal training. "I hope you understand," but he didn't say anything. The next morning, armed with documentation, Laura marched into the school and made it clear that she was more than just a mother. She was a federal investigator specializing in civil rights violations. They had underestimated Caleb's family, and the fallout was immediate. Laura had been waiting in the audience when she noticed Caleb never showed up. She stormed backstage demanding answers and last-minute changes, saying they would remember her son's name. The headmistress quit, and Miss Whitmore was put on leave. But Caleb's struggle continued on a typical Tuesday. During music class, Caleb sat by the window with his violin in hand and played quietly, without trying to attract attention. The melody drifted down the hallway like a prayer, stopping students, teachers, and even janitors who were leaning on their brooms. When he finished, the hallway erupted in applause, and one of the visiting directors from the Manhattan Academy of Music, who happened to be there, approached Caleb and shook his head in amazement. "We'd be honored to offer you a full scholarship," he said. Caleb's mouth dropped wide, and tears filled his eyes as the ancient boundaries. The quiet rejections and whispered abuses broke down, and footage of Caleb's spontaneous performance went viral online. Injustice had attempted to silence him, but instead, they had boosted his voice at his academy debut. Caleb stood backstage with his violin hammered hard, and his polished suit pressed hard. His name reverberated throughout the hall as he stepped forward and began to play, not only for his mother but also for himself and every child who had ever been told they weren't enough. This time the entire world paid attention.